You're listening to Your Financial Pharmacist podcast, a show all about inspiring you, the pharmacy professional, on your path towards achieving financial freedom. Hi, I'm Tim Baker, and today we're changing things up with a new type of episode. I sit down with YFP lead planners, Kelly Reddy-Heffner and Robert Lopez, to walk through a case study of a fictitious family, the Joneses. Although the Joneses are not an actual couple we've worked with, they're really a composite of clients we do work with in reality. The first part of the discussion, we lay the groundwork of the Joneses' jobs and salary situation, where they live. We walk through their net worth and point out important elements of their financial situation. And we also talk about their goals and what they're trying to achieve. We then talk through how we would approach the Joneses' financial plan as if they were real clients. This is a bit of a behind the scenes look at what goes on at YFP Planning. What's up, everybody? Welcome to our first YFP Planning case study. So this is a new concept that the team at YFP Planning is going to test out. We want to launch these, I think, at least once per quarter. And the idea behind this concept for both the podcast and video that will be shown on YouTube is to kind of give you a look behind the scenes of a fictitious client that we are going to work through and look at various information regarding to their financial plan, their goals. And the idea is to kind of give you a behind the scenes of how we would handle this fictitious clients in terms of giving them some thoughts and ideas behind their financial plan. So today I am joined by our two lead planners, Kelly Reddy-Heffner and Robert Lopez. And in a second here, we're going to go through the fact pattern on our first case, the Joneses. And it'll take us a little bit of time to go through all the different facts of the case. And then we're basically going to have like an open table discussion of how we would approach this particular client. So we'll do, this client is fictitious, but it's based on a group of clients that we worked with over the years in terms of some of the planning challenges that they face. And we're going to have a variety of type of clients that we'll talk with as we, roll out this series. So, hey guys, welcome to our first case study. How's things going in your neck of the woods? Kelly.
It's going well. It's good to be back to doing some planning after the tax season. So happy to be talking about a case study.
Yes. Tax season is behind us. I guess we can say that. At least the deadline is. And it was an eventful tax season, no doubt. How about you, Robert? How are things going on your end of things?
Well, we're already in the 90s out here in Arizona. So we're doing our best to make sure the AC doesn't die on us.
Yeah, please, especially with Spencer, make sure he's nice and cool. It's funny, we were just talking about this yesterday. It was like 45 degrees in Columbus, Ohio yesterday. I think this weekend it's going to be like 85. So that is kind of the weather of the season. So, all right. So I'm going to share my screen here. And for those of you on the podcast, you won't be able to actually see this. So we're going to talk through this. If you're watching the video, obviously you'll be able to kind of follow along. And Robert is going to kick us off on kind of the high level facts, and then I will get into the net worth statement, and then Kelly's going to finish us off and kind of talk about goals and some of the other miscellaneous. So Robert, screen is shared. Why don't you kick us off here?
Yeah, just waiting for that screen to load up on my page. So today we're going to be talking about the Joneses. So we're going to try to keep up here. It is Lauren and Jason Jones. They're both 33 years old. Lauren is a clinical pharmacist working at a public hospital. Jason is an electrical engineer, and then 6 months ago, they welcomed their daughter, Lucy, to the world. Lauren earns $118,000 at her main job and then has a side hustle with supplements where she does $10,000 regularly. Jason is getting $112,000 from the electrical engineering firm. They file their taxes, married filing jointly. They are living in wonderful Dallas, Texas. Their gross income combined is $240,000. That breaks down to about $20,000 a month. And then after their taxes and contributions to the cafeteria plan or retirement savings and insurance, they bring home about $14,200 a month. And then that gets chopped up in their expenses. They have fixed expenses of roughly $7,500, variable expenses that can change from month to month of about $3,600. And then their savings target right now is about $2,700 a month. They're living in a 3-bedroom single family house that they bought a few years ago in 2018. They used an FHA loan to put 3.5% down on a $295,000 home. They have a 4.25% interest rate.
Awesome. So if we look at their net worth statement, we're going to start on the asset side. So between checking and savings, they have about 35,000 in a joint account, 85,000 in a savings account, and then Lauren also has a CD of $10,000 that will mature in a year. When we take a look at their investments in their Roth IRA, both Lauren and Jason have Roth IRAs. She has 25,000. Jason has 15. They're not currently contributing to this. This is kind of an IRA, a Roth IRA that was set up with a financial advisor when Lauren was in pharmacy school. Definitely hanging out there. 403B, Lauren has 185,000 that she's contributing 5% with a 3% employer match. She thinks it's primarily in target date funds. That has about 85,000. Jason has a 401k with 55. He's contributing 7% with a 3% match. He also has a Roth 401k, or basically he contributes into the Roth side of things, and he's in an 80-20 allocation. Then he also has an old 401k from a previous employer with about 15,000 he doesn't really know what to do with. And then Lauren has $5,000 in an HSA that she's contributing 3,650, which is the max for a single person for the year, and just sitting in cash right now. They have the primary home that Robert talked about. They think it's worth about $355,000 now that they own jointly. And then if you look at the liability side of things, they do have a credit card balance of $2,000 that they pay off every month. They basically use it for points for travel. They have a personal loan of $6,000. That's Lauren's debt. That's to the bank of mom and dad that they basically pay 0% interest. I think they put about $1,000 towards that, if I have the note right. And then in terms of long-term debt, they both have car notes. So Lauren has a car that has a $15,000 balance. Jason has $23,000. The total payment per month between the two of them is about $825. Jason's interest rate is 5.25. Lauren's is 4%. The mortgage, there's $272,000 left on that. And then Lauren, like a lot of pharmacists out there, has a good amount of student loans. She has a total of 170. 145 of that is in the public program, and then about 25,000 in private student loans with an interest rate of 7%. So you put the total assets of 695 minus their total liabilities of 488,000. That equals their net worth, which is 207,000. So positive net worth, not too shabby at 33. And some other things that they kind of talked about is, they're filing jointly, like Robert said, but and they're doing it themselves, but feel like their situation is becoming more complex, potentially converting their house to a rental. Kelly will talk about that here in a second in terms of goals. The baby, Lucy being born 6 months ago, and then potentially looking at PSLF. They think they're missing out on some deductions, and they typically owe money, $2,000-$3,000 each year that they don't necessarily have a plan to save for. So Kelly, walk us through the Joneses, their goals, and any other miscellaneous things that they have going on.
Yeah, after we get a good idea of net worth, which Tim, you shared with us, and some of those retirement contributions and other things that they're doing, it's really important to understand the goals, because that frames, what we're doing the planning for. So in this case, Lauren wants to aggressively pay off the student loans, but has some concerns about PSLF. Jason is in disagreement. So it's something that's on the list to talk about. They are thinking through adding an addition to their family over the next 2 years. They'd like to start saving for their daughter Lucy's college education, but unsure where to start. Thinking through housing, and if they're going to grow their family, what does that next house look like? They've added an opportunity to maybe turn their current home into a rental property and yield some recurring revenue from that. And then Jason is thinking about some career exploration, not uncommon, of course. We've seen a lot of that over the past year with job changes, transitions. So thinking that through and seeing what that will do to salary. Some of the other things to think about, which also contribute to the conversation, and the one that we'll have here today, is Lauren believes that she could increase her supplemental income. She's bringing in that $10,000 now, but believes she can grow that in the future. Lauren is also thinking through the care of her mom. With children, sometimes we're also worrying about our parents. So she has that on her list to consider in the planning as well. They both like to travel, so having a budget for that is important. And although not a top priority, retirement age of 65 is on the list as a consideration as well.
Awesome stuff, guys. So appreciate us setting that up. So I guess what would be from jump when you guys look at this fact pattern with this particular client, the Joneses? What are some things that jump out to you that you'd want to focus on and kind of dig in and see what we could do in terms of some help with their financial situation?
Kelly, where would you go first?
Well, I certainly would think through, the cash position and how that fits in the context of the goals and some of the debt that they currently have as well. That's a common question is, we've accumulated quite a bit of cash, what do we do with it? So I would say that would probably be a good starting point is, where does it fit with their goals versus other things that they need to accomplish on this list here.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the areas, and this is often true with a lot of our clients, especially, in and around this age is, what the heck are we doing with the student loans, right? So I think as the financial plan goes, as the student loan plan goes, does the rest of the financial plan. So to me, I think having that discussion with Lauren and Jason about to PSLF or not to PSLF, right? And we've recently, Robert, I listened to your episode here recently about PSLF and kind of updates and some of the success stories around PSLF. But I think probably having a conversation about this and then supporting this with the math to determine, does it make sense to go this route or not? What's your thoughts on that, Robert, as you would kind of walk them through this particular part of their, of their plan?
Yeah, so I think it'd be really important to figure out, what Lauren and Jason are disagreeing about when it comes to PSLF. Does she not believe that the program is going to be valid, or does she not believe that her ability to earn this, basically, is she going to work in the public sector for the remainder of those 10 years?
Yeah.
She's already got 30 payments as a part of that 20, and if we're saying that this is happening currently, all 30 of those payments are happening under no dollar payments and no interest, thanks to the COVID changes. So we're already a quarter of the way there. So that gives us, 75% more of the way. I think it's going to be too hard to pass up on the value of that. So really just reiterating that this plan works. Hey, I can point to specific YFP clients. I can point to specific numbers on how many people have earned this forgiveness. I can show how you are or are not on track for your own personal forgiveness to make sure that this is a valuable thing. And that really ties into a lot of the other goals here, right? As we decide to grow the family, that can decrease our payments. As we decide to maybe take a step back from a career that Jason's getting some burnout from, that can, free up some cash flow for us to live month to month and not have to worry about making really aggressive student loan payments. That does allow us to be more aggressive towards the private side. If she wants to be aggressive towards student loans, let's pay off that 7% aggressively, as opposed to something that's at 0% right now and could be at 0% for still a little while. And then show what the value of that forgiveness could look like when we're talking, we're a third of the way, a fourth of the way there. $80,000 of forgiveness easily, depending on what their income is going to look like going forward. I think that's a huge conversation, both emotionally and mathematically, to work through.
Yeah. And I think sometimes, we kind of get caught up in the emotion without actually taking a look at the math. Like, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility, especially like in this day and age with the pandemic and some of the forbearance and the relief there, that, if you have 3 years, 4 years, 5 years of $0 payments, and then if you also have 1 or 2 years that is being calculated on a residency salary, that you could pay, I don't have the numbers in front of me to support it, but you could pay $60,000 in total. And that could be on $170,000, $250,000, $300,000 of debt. And when you look at that total amount of forgiveness, like the amount of being forgiven is not necessarily as important in PSLF. It's more of the amount that you paid. But if you can then minimize that by looking at more of the pre-tax accounts like the 403B, like the 401k. So in this case with Jason, if we're going that route, maybe he doesn't do the Roth, but if they file separately, which they're not doing right now, it doesn't necessarily really matter. But then,
it would. It's a community property state for Texas. So
Texas. Yeah, you're right. Good call out. So like, those are the things that, as when I say, as the student loan goes, the rest of the plan goes. Cause you would argue that you would be able to save more for the long term, but then maybe even more for the short term, whether that's a job transition fund, a vacation fund, or something like that. Because, right now they're paying $2,100 in student loan, the student loan payments, which is probably on the high side. Again, there's probably some meat on the bone with regard to how much they're paying in interest and maybe the compromise is that they pay off the private loans more aggressively, or with the cash that they have on hand, maybe they just write a check and the private loans are gone, and then they pay the minimum on the public loans. So I think, to me, one of the things that jumps out on the fact pattern is, that the two of them disagree on that. I think it's probably having them both come to the table and talk through some of the angst around that. And to your point, Robert, it could be like, I don't think I'm going to stay at this, job very long, and I want to move to the private sector. That's a completely different conversation. But I think having more of those clarifying questions to determine, hey, is this a good, mathematically, it absolutely makes sense in most cases, but from a career perspective, from a emotional perspective, maybe not. So what else kind of, one of the things that we skipped over when we talked about, that I'll kind of go through quickly here. When we talk about, kind of the wealth protection, we typically talk about things like insurance, estate planning. So one of the things to mention is that, they probably were okay insurance wise before their daughter came. I typically say, especially with life insurance, that the two thing, or, a few of the things you look at is if you have a spouse, so check in this case, if you have a house, check, and then you have mouths to feed, you typically want to make sure that you have enough insurance. So right now, Lauren has $500,000 term policy, a 30-year term policy that she bought through the financial advisor when she was in pharmacy school, along with a one-time group benefit that's $118,000, so $600 plus $1,000 in life insurance. Jason has $500,000 that he also bought, and then a $50,000 flat amount through his employer. They also have a small whole life policy that is worth the death benefit is $50,000 with a negligible cash value. They're paying about $70 a month. And then from a short-term and long-term disability, pretty common. Lauren has a 60% benefit for short-term and long-term disability. It is an own occupation. Jason does not have any short-term disability, but he does have a long-term disability that's an own occupation for 2 years, and then it switches to NEOC until Medicare age. We've talked about this on the podcast in terms of like how that works, and maybe something to talk about a little bit more today. Lauren doesn't have any professional liability outside of what her employer offers. And then from a wealth protection perspective, we typically look at the estate plan, and right now they don't have any documents in place, but they're looking at Lauren's employer. They have a legal benefit that they would work through. So if I'm asking the question of like what jumps out, this would probably be one of the, outside of the student loan, this would probably be one of the next things that I would look at in terms of like the wealth protection, particularly with Lucy, being born 6 months ago. Kelly, what's your thoughts as you look at more of the protection stuff, which is often not necessarily at the top of everyone's mind, especially as they're kind of going through a lot of these life changes. But Kelly, what's your take in terms of how they should kind of attack this part of their financial plan?
Yeah, I would agree that this is often an area that is neglected. And even at annual reviews, we sometimes see estate planning documents still on the list. I think with Lucy, for sure, getting, a will in place, guardianship, very important, and having that taken care of would give them a lot of peace of mind as well. As far as insurance coverage too, once you're a parent, it would be highly unusual to probably be under $1 million. If you look at the goals that you have and some of the, high level calculations like 10 times income, that would certainly put both of them, well over $1 million in terms of need. So I do like that it is purchased, outside of their workplace, that it is their own policy, but I guess it would be good to take a look at the details of the policies as well. As far as whole life, we have this conversation all the time. There is very rare circumstances where a whole life policy is cost effective and really necessary in the planning process. So that would be one of the top priorities, to look at that, to see about surrender charges and use that money towards something better in the plan. Perhaps the difference in increasing that term policy up to the amount that would be more adequate. And of course, the disability as well. Speaking of purchasing from outside, we recommend as the gold standard, having your own disability policies. The 60% is reasonable, but Jason doesn't have that short-term disability policy at all. So then you are looking at the emergency fund. Like, does that cover that? Or does he need, his own policy as well? And just really looking at the fine print and the details and seeing, should they, purchase that, on their own as well.
Yeah, you can go out and purchase a short-term disability plan, but it's typically cost prohibitive. So I would probably just pad the emergency fund. He's covered from a long-term disability, but he does have that kind of wonky definition of 2 years own occupation and then any OC after that, which is kind of, a little bit kind of a gray area in terms of what you should do there. If you should go out and price a different policy and kind of carry your own, or just, use what the employer has. When you look at the debt, kind of outside of the student loans, Robert, what are you seeing in terms of, the personal loan, the credit card, the car note, the mortgage in general? Obviously, the conversation has changed a little bit in the last couple weeks and months with interest rates and where they're going. But if you kind of give an assessment of where they're at from a debt perspective, what's that look like to you?
Yeah. One credit card for a family these days is a little odd. I think it's really awesome. We did just have a client come on board that they do just have the one joint card. Using that to for their monthly expenses to gain those points for travel. I love it. Having those points set aside for future travel points is really going to help them. The car notes, 5.25% and 4% on those loans. Those would seem a little bit high in previous years, but it's not too far out of bounds right now. So I'm not sure they could refinance too much out of that. Obviously, paying those off with the delta between what they're getting on their savings accounts is a different conversation on, does it make sense to carry those loans, yay or nay? But those are understandable loan amounts. The student loans at 7% interest, I think we could still maybe refinance those private loans down and probably get a better rate. There's a bunch of tools that you can use online to find better rates between all the servicers. And then the mortgage at 4.25%. Yeah, if we're having this conversation 6 months ago, we're like, let's refinance, let's get out of the FHA and do a conventional. We have at least 26 or 28% of equity in the home, so we wouldn't have PMI on a normal loan.
Yep.
But with the FHA, that PMI stays on for the life of the loan. And if we were to refinance right now, we'd end up with a worse rate. So the conversation with the mortgage would be, how serious are we about getting another house? Are we going to be able to keep it as a rental? I think the math doesn't really work out too well for that because there's only about $200 of gap between what they're paying on their mortgage right now. And if we were to refinance, that gap would even shrink. But how much is it going to cost to refinance from a funding fee or any kind of points we have to pay? How much are we going to save on a monthly rate? Are we going to reset our amortization? I mean, are we going to start back at 30, or are we going to stay at the basically the 26 or 25 years that we have remaining on our loan since we bought in 2018? And we can run those numbers and say, if we keep this house for another 5 years, then, it doesn't make sense. Let's just keep our 4.525%. But if we know we're going to leave within the next 3 years, because we're going to grow our family farther, and maybe want to get into a better school district before we start getting Lucy towards that school age, which is a really common conversation, then maybe the math does start to work out where we could still refi now, get away from that PMI, and then the math is going to flush out better. That's really just a conversation that involves a bunch of steps of what do we really think we want to do with our life? What do we really think the math says? And what decisions does that lead us to? And that's really the power of financial planning, is that process of planning.
Yeah. So much. It's not necessarily about the plan. It's about, the act of planning. And I think, it's an interesting conversation to have, because in this particular case, they think they can get $2,800 a month, as a rental. Right now, their mortgage is, $2,600. They're paying that on a 30-year 4.25. Probably when we wrote this out, 4.25 was actually, a higher rate. And if you can get that down and get rid of the PMI, maybe your delta between what you can rent and what your mortgage would be is a lot more. But, the other argument is because inventories are so low in lots of different parts of the country, probably Dallas included, maybe the rent you can get is not $2,800. Maybe it's $3,000, $3,200. I don't know. But those would be some of the things that I want to dive a little bit deeper. For some people too, it's like, what's the catalyst behind renting it out? If it is from a wealth building perspective, maybe to your point, the math says, maybe sell it and roll it into your new home and minimize, expenses on that. Maybe it is because maybe with Jason, maybe part of his idea in terms of shifting careers is more along the lines of supplementing his new career with real estate or something like that. And it's maybe an effort to diversify income. But to your point, I think it's just like the PSLF discussion. I think it's having a conversation that is supported with the kind of the emotional, but also the math in terms of what it looks like. And because things change, it seems like all the time with markets and interest rates and home values and rental, all that kind of stuff, it constantly changes. So I think having, a little bit more of a clarifying discussion would make sense. Kelly, if we assume that we're going to go down the PSLF route, and we're really trying to make sure that the investments are buttoned up and really the cash is deployed in the most optimized sense. Like we're looking at with this particular client, what do we say? About $130,000 in cash between check-in savings and the CD they have. So if we look at, kind of we think would be in an emergency fund and how we would set up their investments, what are some opportunities for this excess of cash, and what they could potentially do with that? What's your take on that? And if they're asking, hey, because one of the things that we're hearing from real clients is like, hey, with the forbearance, we haven't been paying towards our loans and our have ballooned, and we know that that's good, but it's also a bad thing because that cash is kind of just sitting there, not really doing anything. So if you're looking at things like travel or transition or a mom fund, like how would you approach the client in terms of trying to deconstruct what to do with this cash?
I do think, and I'm not sure if I'll answer the question specifically, but I think it is indirectly related. Like it does really help to earmark those large portions of cash. Like, so what is the emergency fund? Like we say 6 months, those necessary expenses, mortgage, student loan payment, car payments. From there, the travel budget, really tying in a specific amount to a specific goal is very important. So then once you see what that looks like, that is a much better view of what's left. And I guess in terms of debt, I would kind of take a look at, is it paying off the private loan? We get asked that a lot, like invest versus the private loan. I would see about a refi rate versus just paying it off directly. But in terms of the wealth building, there's certainly a lot of opportunities if you're pursuing a PSLF option to really look at how much is being contributed into the 403B. It's well under the limit of 20,500 for 2022. Jason's going into the Roth side. He's not at the maximum either. So looking at that contribution rate. Now with Lucy, I guess asking the question, is Lucy on Lauren's health insurance or Jason's? Yeah. If she can be on Lauren's, that HSA, amount increases substantially as well to over $7,000. So those would be the places where that's always a great conversation with PSLF is, what else can you be doing? So not only are you not paying the student loan, you're not having to put that money towards a payment amount, but then you're also building wealth on the back end too, towards your savings capacity.
What do you guys typically see, or what do you typically recommend in for an average client like this in terms of an emergency fund? Are we saying an emergency fund is 80,000, 10,000? Like what do you, if you had to do a roundabout guess in terms of what you're seeing in terms of an average emergency fund, what would you say you're seeing?
Yeah, I like to break cash down to pure ratios. So my checking accounts, I like to have a floor. Everybody resets their zero when they're making it in life, right? When you're in high school and college, maybe it's $0 is true zero. When you make a little bit of money, it's $1,000 and it's $10,000 you want to have that feels like your real oh no moment. There we go. So I like to see 1.5x. So 1.5 times your monthly expenses in your checking account. That's just to make sure you never overdraft, you never do anything crazy. From a savings account perspective, we always hear that 3 to 6 months. For two people, if they're both in very secure jobs, I think 3 months is going to be good enough. That's generally going to be long enough for long-term disability to kick in, depending on the plan, if it's got a 90-day or 180-day exclusion period. If we're thinking that maybe there's going to be some career change opportunity happening, then I'd like to be closer to 6 months of monthly expenses. I definitely want to be closer to that. And you can decide if that's just fixed expenses or if it's all expenses. People are generally really bad at judging out what their expenses are from a monthly basis. So I just take all expenses and make that our emergency savings. So for a client like this, I think that we're just going to need to have 60 grand kind of set aside. They're spending about 10K a month between fixed and variable expenses. So if we want 6 months of that, then 60K in an emergency savings would be about right for them.
Yeah, and that's about half of what the cash that they have on hand, thereabouts. I think, typically, and it would probably, in a traditional case, if Lauren and Jason were saying like, hey, we're good with these jobs, and more than likely they're probably pretty secure, it might be half of that. But I think to account for some of the transition and give them some runway, if he does take a step back in salary, makes a lot of sense. I'm with you, Kelly. I personally like the idea of setting up a high yield savings account that is called emergency fund, setting up a high yield savings account or sub accounts that's called travel. Our travel fund at Ally has sub accounts that is like RV camping trips, Paris, which we just got back from. Our big trip this year is Disney World, right? So like the idea is that we have goals for each of them that like, once we hit them, we kind of turn that off and then we go on to the next thing. So we nerd out a little bit and get very granular with that. And I think it does help because it kind of pushes the goals. Sometimes I think if you have a big pot of money, you're kind of doing some of the earmarking already, but it's a little bit more nebulous. So it's like, oh, okay, I think some of this is for X, some of this is for Y. I'm like, if you're going to do that anyway, just actually, do the accounting. So that's not everyone's cup of tea. I get it. Sometimes it's more percentages or things like that. But I think sometimes that's one of the beauties of like a 401k or an IRA is that, when you save money into your 401k, it automatically comes out of your paycheck. But for you to reach into that cookie jar and get that money out, there's a lot of penalties, 10%, you pay taxes and things like that. So at least from a savings perspective, we're labeling it and we have a goal set up that, if I rob the Disney World account to go buy a Tesla, I'm kind of going through that at least mental barrier to do that. So I'm a proponent of kind of building a savings plan and draw on those lines. Let's talk about one thing that we haven't talked about too much in depth is just the investments. So when you look at, are they saving enough right now? 5%, 7% for Lauren and Jason respectively. They do get a match. Target date funds, 80-20 allocation for Lauren and Jason respectively. They have a taxable account for, it's a Robinhood account that he's doing like individual stocks and ETFs. What's your overall impression, Kelly, of like the investment account? And then let's talk about the retirement stuff, and then we'll pivot and we'll talk about the education stuff. So Kelly, what's your take when you look at their investments?
Right. I mean, sometimes target date funds are the best option in an employer sponsored plan, but that would be the first place I would look to see, what are the fees for the target date funds? Does it match, Lauren's risk tolerance and appropriate asset allocation? And see if there's, a portfolio that can be developed that, would be better. Again, sometimes that's not the case. As far as Jason, I guess I would be wondering if the 80-20 asset allocation was appropriate for his age, and if maybe he should be taking on a little bit more risk now. But of course, we'd be looking at his score and having that conversation from the risk tolerance. As far as kind of just in general with the taxable accounts too, I think one of the lessons from the tax season is just that these do have an impact on our tax liability, which can sometimes be a surprise at the end of the year. So I think it's always good to check in on, just having that conversation, like how does this fit with overall goals and what you want to accomplish, and making sure just some high level facts. The IRS is now having the conversation about cryptocurrencies, like know what to expect, wash sales, all those pieces that individual investors, really do need to take into account as they're thinking through, how they manage those. Would it be better somewhere else too?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I would call out here is, in the fact pattern, they're doing Jason's doing $200 into his Robinhood account, so $2,400. I would just ask the questions like, what's it for? And sometimes the answer is like, I don't know, just to mess around, which is fine. But like, is that worth maybe deferring? Should we earmark this for like the transition fund or for, X, Y, or Z? The other thing that they're probably doing that they don't necessarily need to do because they have the cash is, they're putting $500 into a joint account. They're probably set there. Maybe we redeploy that into a travel fund or a mom fund or something like that. But I would agree with you, target date funds might be okay, might not be the most cost effective or align best with the risk tolerance. You could argue with Jason being 33 and 80-20 allocation, 20% in bonds, might not be the best. Is there an opportunity to invest the HSA? Right now it's sitting all in cash. She has 5,000. She's contributed another 3650. Might be an opportunity to kind of get that rolling and maybe cash flow some health expenses. With a baby coming up, maybe they don't stay in a high deductible health plan, and maybe they switch over for that, for that year, which kind of turns off the HSA. So all of these things I think are on the table. Robert, as you look at the education, so we see this a lot, but Lauren and Jason are basically saying like, we want to save for Lucy's education. She's 6 months old. Sometimes people feel behind even at 6 months old, but don't know where to start. They're in Dallas, Texas. How would you start that conversation of how to approach, the college savings conversation?
Yeah, anybody who's got student loans wants to make sure that their children don't have the same problems and issues that they have. So it's a really common thing of what can we be doing and when should we be doing it. With 529s, college savings accounts, those are probably going to be your best bet in most places. Unless they're both alumni of a particular school, and that school has some prepaid credit options where you can actually pay for college credits now and they'll be matched whatever they are in the future, that would be an option. But for the most part, 529 savings plans are where it's at. Now, in other states, you get a discount on your state taxes for that. Texas does not have any state taxes for income, so they could choose any 529 they like. There's some great ones out there. Some of my favorite ones actually have a feature that allows you to send a link to family. So then family can send money to the 529 as well. So that's a great way to go about it as well. Even if you just set that account up, I guarantee I have a 9-month-old here in the house and they have way too many toys, and people are going to start sending them more toys within the next 6 months. So if instead of just sending out a 529 plan, link to somebody that they can give $50 to the education savings account instead, is better than having a little plastic drum and behind you in a video. So your kid can make noises in meetings. So that's a great way to go about it. But really anything they do now is going to be beneficial. We're never sure what the college landscape is going to look like in the future.
Yeah.
Highly unlikely that it's going to stay on the same trajectory that it's at now. That would be completely untenable. But just getting something going, and then allowing other family members to contribute, so then they can also feel like they're involved in Lucy's life. This may be the first grandchild. This could be the first nephew, the first cousin. This could be the first of many, or the first of only. So we really want to make sure that everyone can be included.
Yeah, it's so true. It's like the war on plastic. I feel like, Liam has so many like cars and things like that. Like he doesn't need any more of that stuff. So here's a link and we contribute, do a gift that way. I think one of the places I would start, even before kind of getting to that vehicle, and to your point with them being in Texas where there is no state income tax, they can, and you can do this in any state, but a lot of the time if you're a resident of Ohio, you're going to contribute to Ohio's. If you're a resident of Maryland, you're going to contribute to Maryland's, because they give tax benefits for those. But not all 529s are created equal. So you have different expenses and things like that. So you definitely want to make sure that you're finding a plan that all things being equal, it has good investments, low cost, that type of thing. But I think probably one of the things that I would at least start the conversation, and sometimes it's like, I don't know, is like, what's the goal, right? So I've seen the spectrum, Robert, where it's like, well, I've had to deal with my student loans, so my kid has to figure that out as well, to like what you said is like, I never want my kid to have to go through this. So to me, it's kind of deconstructing, like, what is the goal? So most of the time I feel like when I ask that question of what's the goal with the, kind of planning for your kid's education, it's shrug emoji, like, not really sure. But then, sometimes we paint a little of a picture of, so we talked about like the 1/3 rule, in prior podcasts. So 1/3 could be you saving in something like a 529. 1/3 of tuition and fees could be from when Lucy is 18 and you're basically paying tuition out of your present paycheck. And then 1/3 could be from things like grants, scholarships, and then last but not least, student loans. So you kind of attack it that way. So if you're trying to achieve a funding goal of 33% in your 529, you can work with an advisor and try to figure out what that is. So, but I think it's kind of having that conversation and kind of get, I know some clients are like, I want to put my kid through 4 years of college, a master's, doctorate. And then, that's obviously a much bigger, monthly amount that they have to save for. But, the earlier that you do it, the better. Because if not, if you're still trying to achieve that, you're paying that much, much more in future dollars without the benefit of it being able to invest and compound. So I think it's a worthy conversation as you kind of build out that part of the plan. Any other call outs that you would say as you're looking at this particular couple, the Joneses, that, either from a tax perspective, a cash, a debt, a wealth protection with insurance, that you would say, hey, this is probably something that we really need to talk about? I mean, I think probably the one that we didn't dive too deep in is like, what is the future prospects of kind of the supplemental income? She kind of makes it seem in here that she can increase it, fairly substantially. But then also probably the other thing that I would want to talk more about is just kind of what's the situation with mom. What's that timeline? What's that look like? How are we going to prepare for that? Is that something that we're looking at in terms of like the next home purchase, which again is probably another point of conversation, is what's the timeline for that? What's your guys' take on that?
I mean, I think, right, like the housing, we just had a recent conversation with a client about, their next house. They were thinking through about having room for a parent, or both sets of parents. I think when we do the estate planning conversation, it is always interesting how a lot of times it does, come up about parents and their needs too. So making sure they have documents in place that are clear and that you have a good understanding of expectations really important, because, it is a lot of work to take care of a child and a parent at the same time. So the more clarity, you can have, the better, for sure. So I would say that's, pretty important. Do they need long-term care insurance? Do they have it? What resources do they have, available to help you help them in the process?
Yeah, absolutely. How about you, Robert? Any other closing thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know if we touched on the
case?
professional liability. I think that's a big one.
Yeah.
Getting that policy in place. The hospital's protecting her when she's at work, but definitely not when she's doing her supplemental income job. And even if the hospital's protecting her, they're really protecting themselves. So it's really important to have a policy of your own. These policies are very inexpensive relative to some of the other stuff we're paying. So I think that going out and getting a professional liability policy would be easy and quick and a good solution.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's some work to be done on the wealth protection stuff with the estate documents, probably re-looking at some of the life insurance, maybe disability, but yeah, professional liability, low hanging fruit. I definitely probably in down the road, if they are looking at like a rental property and another, probably one of the things that we haven't called out here, that we typically see with a lot of our clients that have kids, that they don't take advantage of all the things available to them, i.e. like a FSA for dependent care. So if that's something that, Lucy, we're spending money on with Lucy, so probably, some help with taxes in the future, perhaps, especially if they're looking at a PSLF. Now you could argue with Texas, there's no state income tax. So you really just need help with the federal, but as you're looking at maybe a rental property, another baby, PSLF, and you feel like you're missing out on deductions and you're owing that money, maybe some proactive planning around that. As the financial situation becomes more complex, is something that you might want to get a helping hand with. So, but yeah, good stuff, guys. We'll leave it there. Really appreciate the conversation. Looking forward to doing many more of these in the future. And yeah, thanks for doing this today.
Yeah, enjoyed it, Tim.
All right, thanks, Tim.
As we conclude this week's podcast, an important reminder that the content on this show is provided to you for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding materials should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on the podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist unless otherwise noted, and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you again for your support of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. Have a great rest of your week.